The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar. Tonight's topic is progressive parenting. So first we'll introduce your hosts. We have Erin Matson, one of the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction, and I am based in Arlington, Virginia.
And this is Pamela Merritt. I'm the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction, and I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri.
I'm Rachel Perrone. I'm a communications consultant and fangirl of Reproaction, and I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Rachel. So the agenda for tonight is an introduction of Reproaction. For those of you who have not been on our webinars before, we'll explain exactly what we're about and how we make change. And then we're going to have a discussion of why a conversation about progressive parenting is important. That's going to be followed by a discussion about creating activist spaces that are friendly to new parents. And then there's going to be a panel discussion featuring Veronica Arreola, Program Director, Latinas Gaining Access to Networks for Advancement in Science at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and Rachel, who you just heard, Communications Consultant. And then we'll go through some next steps, and there will be time at the end for a Q&A with panelists. The hashtag for live tweeting is Reproaction. So Reproaction is a new direct action group that formed to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are so proud of our left flank analysis, of our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they identify as allies or opposition, and of our commitment to nonviolent direct action. Erin.
Thank you. So just to quickly tee this up, why is a conversation about progressive parenting important? Well, reproductive justice is the right to parent, the right not to parent, and the right to raise families in safe and healthy communities. Feminism is a movement for equality for women in all aspects of our lives. Thus, a conversation about reproductive justice, rights, or feminism is incomplete if parenting and caregiving aren't big pieces of that conversation. And I want to create space to acknowledge that sometimes, particularly with regards to feminist quarters, that it's not always parenting friendly. And sometimes you hear assumptions that that childless or child-free women have a better shot at getting ahead. And I just want to acknowledge that that's really not the movement that we're fighting for as progressives. And that's one of the reasons why we're hosting this webinar tonight. So progressive parenting, one thing to be clear is that parenting itself can be activism. So the values we raise our kids with impact everyone's future. And activist spaces and progressive workspaces must be accessible to parents or they're simply not progressive. And unfortunately, that's not always the case, where workspaces or activist spaces that hold themselves up as progressive are actually parent and family friendly. But we're working on that, and we're excited to have this conversation with you tonight. So now I want to introduce our development lead, Elizabeth Skoski, who's based in Irvington, New York. Liz is a member of our team, and we value her highly, and she also happens to be the newest parent on our team. So she's going to lead us through a presentation about creating activist spaces that are friendly to new parents. Liz, thank you.
Great, thank you, Erin. So I had a baby in January, and it just so happened that 4 other friends and family members also had kids within the last year. So what I did was I went to them and I said, what are some tips or tricks that you would like to see put into place? So these, like it says, are some very unscientific, completely anecdotal, crowdsourced suggestions for organizers, employers, and new parents. So for organizers, one of my biggest pet peeves, and it's a personal pet peeve, but it's one that I've heard repeated by a couple other people, is this idea of feeding. Feeding is a top priority for when you're bringing a newborn, whether they're breastfed or bottle fed. There's got to be a place to feed. And what I often see happen is there's a place to feed a a newborn, but they're labeled nursing rooms or they're labeled pumping rooms, which are great. It's amazing that those things are starting to exist in more public places. But as a formula feeding mom, sometimes it got a little tricky knowing which space I was allowed to access. So the mommy moors are silly, but they're very real. And having it just labeled as feeding is a really nice way to make it more accessible for everyone who's coming. Considering transit-friendly locations, a lot of parents live in the city, but there are also a ton that live in the suburbs. Me and my husband are one of the people who migrated out to the suburbs. So taking the train into the city isn't difficult. Where it starts to get difficult is if you have to take the train to the main area and then get on a subway or get on a bus. So thinking about if people are coming in from another place and they're bringing a kid with them, is it accessible for them? Is it a really accessible location that they can get to? Same thing with after work hours are pretty much a dead zone. If it's after 7 p.m., you're probably not going to get parents. Kids are usually in bed by 7 or 8. So getting help for the time is really expensive, or it's a big kick to the schedule. And beyond that, you're going to be asking people to give up those 1 or 2 hours, which are usually the only hours they get to see their kid at night. So thinking about doing lunchtime hour actions or weekend actions is really great. Ramp accessibility and stroller friendly make me so happy. It's just wonderful when someone advertises that you're going to be able to get your stroller into the place. But if the ramp goes to a tiny room that's packed with chairs and there's no place to actually fold the stroller or put it, that becomes an issue. Same thing if you're advertising parent friendly, thinking about there's going to be multiple strollers, there's going to be lots of different contraptions kids are going to be sitting in. If you section off a place where parents can put those, it really helps ease the anxiety of bringing a kid into a new place. And then something that is always welcome is giving parents an out. I have a 10-month-old. She's usually pretty well behaved, but when she starts to cry, it is so much more anxiety inducing than I ever could have imagined. So when your baby fusses in public, it makes you anxious, it makes you stressed, you feel embarrassed. So if you're the organizer of an event, something as easy as saying like, I see we have some kids here. If you don't mind if the kids fuss, then say that's fine if your kid fusses, but if you need to take them outside, there's a space at the end of the hall, there's a room, next door. If you or your kid needs a break, feel free to come and go as you need. So just having that availability to have an out should something happen. So then for employers, top one is always lead by example, even if you're not a parent. So if you're in a leadership position and you're a parent, sharing your childcare struggles, your daycare dilemmas, your doctor's appointments, all of that makes the parenting struggle feel like you're part of the team instead of just a parent who's always coming up with these issues. If you're not a parent, prioritize your own family time. Make your doctor's appointments and make a show of going to them and keeping them. Prioritize your personal days, your mental and physical health. That sends this message that the workplace values your life outside of your job. The postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety is very, very real. It can appear months after birth, and it affects both mothers and fathers. So the popular narrative in our culture is that it usually happens close to birth and goes away soon afterwards, but not necessarily true. I remember around 7 months before coming out of the baby fog. So it was a really long time. So if you're a big organization, creating something like a parenting Slack channel. If you're a smaller organization, doing check-ins afterwards, after they come back for that first week, 4, 5, 6 months afterwards is super appreciated. This one was from my friend. Ensure lactation rooms have appropriate accommodations. So I think we've moved past the point where employers are trying to I hope we've moved past the point where they're trying to set up bathrooms or closets as lactation rooms. But if the space isn't really conducive for pumping, is it really a good lactation room? So are there outlets for the pump? Is there a sink or a microwave to wash parts? Is there a place to store the milk in the refrigerator? And she said to me, it was great that they gave me a pumping room, but it just wasn't a place where you wanted to spend half an hour 3 times a day. It was cold. There was a window that had to be covered. It got really spotty internet. So if you're going to offer a lactation room or a pumping room to people, making sure that it's a place that you would want to go and spend an hour or 2 hours out of your day multiple times throughout the day. Making sure that your workplace culture, that the extra isn't the norm. So team dinners and team happy hours are super fun, but they exclude anybody who has the responsibility for afternoon daycare pickup. So team lunches are a great suggestion instead, and don't make staying late proof of caring more. And then the last one is a personal one for me. So asking if there's little things that would make a big difference. So when I was coming back to work, Erin actually asked me if there was something in the schedule that I wanted to try to keep, if there was something that I could rearrange my hours so I could have time with my daughter to do something special. And I was going to a mom's group during my maternity leave that was really saving my sanity, but it met at 10 in the morning on a Thursday. So I thought that that was going to be an impossibility to keep going. But knowing that she would support that and having that availability to continue that was really more than I could have ever asked for. So looking at the schedule and saying, what is something that you can do? Can you fit this in? Can you make it work? I'll support you in doing that. So that really made a huge difference to me. And then my last one for new parents, lower your expectations. I was going to be that person with the newborn at March for Our Lives. I was going to be that person at Rally to Keep Families Together with my baby strapped to my chest. I was not that person. She was a newborn. I could barely get to the grocery store. Then she was a 3-month-old, and her nap schedule became the most important thing in the world to me. So it's okay to go to the local protest and not the national protest. It's okay to take a break from social media and not have an opinion, but to take a step back and think about it first. It's okay to donate instead of volunteer. So like Erin said in the beginning, parenting in itself is activism. It took me a while to get to that point because it feels like the world is burning at this very moment, but thinking about how am I making it better for my child in the long run, that's the game that I want to play.
Liz, that was just awesome. Thank you so much. And a personal thank you to you as well. So, so if you have any questions for Liz, feel free to put any questions in the chat box. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. So now I'm very excited to initiate our panel discussion. I'm going to go through 2 biographies and then we'll get started with questions for Veronica and Rachel. So first I'll introduce Veronica Arreola. She is a nationally recognized expert on women in higher education and a women's rights advocate. She has brought visibility to women's and Latinx issues through writing that has been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, the Christian Science Monitor, Bitch Media, and the Women's Review of Books. And her leadership has been recognized by being named Woman of the Year by the University of Illinois Chicago Chancellor's Committee on the Status of Women, with the Chicago Foundation for Women's Impact Award, Leadership Illinois, and Negocios Now Who's Who in Chicago Hispanic Power. Both her bachelor's degree in biological sciences and a master's in public administration were earned at UIC, and both with concentrations in gender and women's studies. Arreola still considers herself a first-generation college student, as she was the first member of her family to earn a bachelor's and master's degree. And Veronica, it's such a pleasure to have you here tonight. Welcome. Thank you. And I also see, Veronica, if you could work to unmute yourself or make yourself available on audio while I introduce Rachel.
Awesome.
So,
hi.
Oh, Veronica, welcome. Are you here?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction.
Great. Delighted to have you. Thank you. And then our second panelist is Rachel Perrone, who is a communications consultant with more than a decade of experience with progressive and nonprofit organizations. From strategic plans to statewide press lists and everything in between, she's done it. But at the heart of her work and what she enjoys most is building relationships, connecting ideas in interesting or unexpected ways, or bringing people together to collaborate and create. Her background is primarily in gender and economic justice, including reproductive rights and health policy, voting rights, workplace fairness, and related issues. Working with so many legal and policy experts in these fields, She now includes among her superpowers the ability to distill dense topics into everyday, relatable language. And as a point of personal privilege, I will share that Rachel was on a panel that I moderated at Netroots this year that was also called Progressive Parenting, and thrilled to have you here tonight. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, great. Okay, so first, so just to be clear about the flow of this, I'm going to open up all of these questions to both Veronica and Rachel. Let's start with Veronica first on our first question. How does how we raise our kids matter for our social movement?
It matters a ton. It matters. I think it's everything. Not to put too much pressure on all of us, but I think when we look at all the issues that we're grappling with right now, especially this moment with toxic masculinity, xenophobia, racism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these phobias that are learned behaviors, in my opinion. So it's just overwhelmingly awesome to see families raise kids in a way that's not just intolerant of different people, of people who may not look like us, who have different stories, but accepting and loving. So I think that if we are in this movement, if we are progressives, if we are feminists, if we're intersectional feminists, we need to be raising our kids in that same manner, so that hopefully they'll grow up to be as intersectional, as feminists, and as progressive as we hope them to be.
Thank you. Rachel.
I think about it in a couple ways. When we did the panel at Roots, one of our panelists, Ben, had a great line about, that it matters to the future of the movement. Like, we are raising the next generation of progressive leaders. So I think of it sort of in two ways. Like, personally, for my children, it matters, and I should upfront, my kids are 9 and 11. Helping them to make sense of the world, especially in this exceptionally challenging moment. Helping them to make sense of what's happening in the news, what's happening with their friends, sort of teaching them kindness and compassion and understanding the ways in which their friends' lives differ from theirs, or the challenges they face that, that my kids don't. So understanding the world for themselves in their own hearts. And then also, I feel a level of responsibility for how they will make positive, progressive change in the future. Like, the people that they will turn out to be. Will they be allies? Will they be kind and compassionate? And, just see people where they are, in their own lives.
Thank you. Yes, one of the things for me as a parent that's been really exciting, and one of my proudest moments, relates to teaching my daughter the values, and then watching her in some cases school me on things that had become invisible and unconscious to me. So she's quite aware that mommy's a feminist, and if someone says that only boys can do one thing or only girls can do one thing, and they can't give you a good reason why, then it's probably stupid. And she turned to me one day out of the blue and said angrily, "Why do we only go to see boys play sports?" And she just threw me against the wall when she said that. I was so proud of her, and that was the moment when we started going to the junior varsity basketball games for our neighbor across the street. So I do think it's really important, not only for the future, but for the now, and that kids can help move us along. So the next question, let's start with Rachel. So this, as both Veronica and Rachel mentioned, these are extraordinarily difficult and challenging times for our country. Our country has always been marked by racism, sexism, and homophobia, xenophobia, and systemic oppression against people on a wide variety of levels. That said, that all exists, and we also have the resurgence of an open, overt Nazi movement in America. We have a president who openly brags about sexual assault in his tear gassing children. And I want to ask, how do we communicate with our kids about the troubling things happening in our country, and for that matter, even our work and the things that we do as progressives in age-appropriate ways?
It's a small question. I mean, I start by sort of navigating between being open and truthful. Like, I don't hide that much from them. I'm pretty frank with what's happening in the world, what's happening, you know, how we're feeling or whatever, because I want them to be able to talk to me very openly and honestly. So that, but also we have to be able to leave the house, right? I'm trying not to terrorize them with all of the terrifying things that are happening in the world. A while back, I'm single, and when my ex and I separated, I went and saw a therapist for a bit to learn about how to communicate all that was happening to my kids. And remember, one of those valuable things she said to me was not to be afraid to show the kids uncertainty, that it was okay to be unsure and confused and to sort of be in that space with them, not to sort of wall myself off like, you know, as a mother, like, I want to protect you, I know everything, I can fix everything. That it's okay sometimes to not be that. And I've carried that through into like the work that I do and the way that I talk to them about what's happening in the world. Like, I can sort of on paper explain to you where sort of hatred or bigotry or fear comes from, but I don't get it. I don't understand it. So I feel free to sort of have those conversations with kids and reach a point where I go, I don't know why they think that. Like, they're just wrong. I can explain it to you, but I don't get it, you know? Or if there is another issue that we don't understand, like, we will just seek out the answers together. You know, we'll watch videos or people telling their own stories of marginalized communities or you know, various struggles that are happening, you know, watching sort of less terrorizing videos or reading the news or listening to podcasts or something.
Thank you. Okay, Veronica, so how do we communicate with our kids about the troubling things happening in our country, and for that matter, even our work, in age-appropriate ways?
So my daughter is 15. So right now, in this moment, we talk pretty frankly, and I often talk to her as almost like a peer sometimes, and sometimes I talk to her as if I'm talking to her as in mom mode. It's like I'm trying to teach her a moment, and talking really frank about the news. And a lot like Rachel, when she was younger, I didn't hide a lot. We listened to NPR on the way to school, watching the news at night, and talking about things that are happening, taking her to protests and rallies. But what I heard another friend say on Facebook recently was that to talk to kids in a way that doesn't say that there are so much bad people, but people who do bad things. And I know that I tried to do that when she was younger and didn't always live up to it, but I was a really great reminder to talk to kids about what things are happening, and that we hold this power within ourselves to make these decisions. And not to think that there are good people and bad people, because then I think that takes power away from people and away from our kids, to say that because you're a good person that you can't hurt somebody. But no, that we all have the power to hurt somebody with our words, with our bodies, all of these things. And by saying that there are people who do bad things, to make them think they have to be cognizant of how they interact with other people, whether it's their classmates or just anyone on the street.
Mm-hmm. And I'd also like to call in Liz, if I could. So Liz is, before coming to us and in a previous life, she was actually a school teacher. And so I know, Liz, you've done lockdown drills with kids, and I'd love to hear about how you've done that in that work in age-appropriate ways.
Yeah, I taught high school for 5 years. The lockdown drills were probably some of the hardest things to do. They started as one of those once a year things that you just had to do, like fire drills, things like that. And the kids didn't really take them that seriously, and you would try to get them to take them seriously. And then it was like after Sandy Hook, it all shifted and they became much more real and they became much more scary. And you had to have those conversations about this is why we're preparing, that there is the possibility that this could happen because, like the panelists said, you didn't want to sugarcoat it. You didn't want to pretend that it's never going to happen here. But yeah, like they said, to couch it in this idea of we can't live our lives in constant fear of this. We can do our best to prepare for it, but we're not going to hide ourselves in our room. We're not going to keep the doors constantly locked. We're not going to school at home, things like that.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Liz. Okay, so my next question, and let's start with Veronica, touches back on some of the themes that Liz was talking about in relation to new parents, but let's broaden the conversation. How can we make sure our activist spaces are accessible for families?
I feel like that's been covered. We need to have spaces that are accessible, events that are held in accessible times. And if not, then to accept the fact that if somebody is a parent and engaged in your community, wants to attend your informational, your workshop, that there's a good chance they're going to tote a kid or two with them, and to accept that. And even start labeling things like this will be family friendly. There will be a corner where, there'll be a lot of coloring books and kids can play there, eat their snacks, eat dinner, pick up sandwiches on the way kind of thing. But to just create an atmosphere that's like, if you have to bring your kids, it's going to be okay, and not to allow, side-eyed people from from looking at your kids when they're a little fussy or need some help at the restroom.
Thank you. And I think just to affirm that last point too, that so much of this is internal at times. There's the external, but there's also the internal, and which Liz also spoke about, like the fear of if there's fussiness, like, oh, are you going to look at me? Are you concerned about what my kid is doing? So I appreciate that. So Rachel, let's put the question over to you. How can we make our activist spaces more accessible for families?
Yeah, sort of building on some of the things that Liz said earlier, that you're, as a parent and with your kids, like your needs sort of ebb and flow as they get older, right? So, we're super self-conscious when they're babies and they're crying, but on the outside, you've got like the cute tiny baby, and maybe people want to hold the baby, and there's a level of understanding or compassion. I mean, you definitely get the side eye, don't get me wrong, but you may also get I want to hold the baby. But when he's a rambunctious 9-year-old, less amusing. Now I have school obligations I didn't have when they were, I've got, because, your schools have these attitudes that nobody works. So, festivals in the middle of the day, and it's the poetry festival at 1 o'clock, and it's the, Hispanic Heritage Festival at 2 o'clock, and, I'm calling out constantly. So I'm sort of going back to what you said about having employers who, visibly prioritize their own personal life and their own family life, and making that an acceptable thing to do. Like there's an organization here in town that I don't work for, but that one of their leave policies, you get the equivalent of 3 days worth of time specifically to take off for your kids' school events. I had never heard of such a thing. I think it's wonderful. You only need a few hours, but they're plunk in the middle of the day. So the little things like that can really make a huge difference.
Thank you. Yes, and that's so true that often the school things are right smack in the middle of the day. Not at the beginning of the school day or the end. They just have to put it right in the middle. Mm-hmm. So that's how it works. Okay, so I'll close it up with our last question for Rachel and Veronica, and let's start with Rachel this time. How can our progressive workspaces better support the needs of working parents and caregivers?
I don't know what more to add. But I think within organizations, sort of going, repeating some of the things we said before, it comes back to both office policies and also attitudes. I mean, I've worked places where, on paper, all of the policies were in place and maybe I wouldn't have been fired or we weren't technically breaking any sort of laws, but I was certainly unwelcome or was made to feel uncomfortable. Just in tone, to the point where I was hiding the existence of my children, where, all of their pediatrician appointments became my appointment because I just didn't want to discuss the fact that I had to go, because it was, verboten. But, so it's just a question of office culture, I guess.
Thank you for that. And Veronica?
Yeah, so I have studied a bit about different policies on paper and how they just don't always live up to that expectation or their promise, because there's just some dissonance that happens between writing a policy for HR and the practice. Take it, for example, flex time. That's too often flex time is sold as a way to ease yourself back in or only work part-time or adjust your hours, but then the rest of the staff, particularly leadership, just doesn't live up to that. And so that's really where I think progressive workplaces have to work on. Is we have a lot of things written down, we have a lot of great policies out there, but I've definitely met people who make like the top, they always have those lists of top 10 places for working moms to work, and I've met people in those organizations and they're like, yeah, if you use those things, you're never going anywhere. Or fathers can't use those policies because they're never going to get anywhere. So things like that, as well as just our language. There's still a tendency to think that if you're going to give a parent some time to go off to leave early to take a kid to a pediatrician, because I don't know why pediatricians have to stop at 6 o'clock when we work till 5, then, saying, well, handing it off to the person without a kid or a small child. Those sorts of things add to the resentment in the workspace, as opposed to, that can wait another day unless it's an urgent thing. But to really start to just examine how you interact with people.
Thank you. Yes, the always on, always urgent culture is an important facet of this discussion. So if folks have questions for Veronica or Rachel or Liz, feel free to put them in the chat box. We'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. Before I close out the panel discussion, I actually would like to kick a question to my co-director, Pamela. And Pamela is a primary caregiver of an adult sibling. And so I want to ask you, Pamela, how does this discussion extend to the progressive movement's responsibilities to support caregiving more generally? And what is the same and what's different?
That's such a great question. So thank you for asking it. I really think this discussion needs to expand to include caregivers, but also to acknowledge that it is different, that, I don't necessarily have I'm looking at, God willing, a 40-year commitment with my older brother that needs different support and also needs different policy. But I also think that there are so many parallels when you look at, the things that were listed off by Liz for creating activist spaces. There's so many similarities where, I want to be able to bring my brother to certain spaces, but he is autistic. And so are those spaces friendly? Are they, equipped for somebody who needs different sensory interactions? And more importantly, are they safe? We've had a lot of discussions, both within our organization and in the broader progressive movement about events that have law enforcement on that show up, and for Black men with autism, that presents its own challenges. So I think the discussion itself is a point of activism, and so I welcome, and I'm so proud that we are having this discussion tonight. What differs, I think, is that there tends to be this there's this history of looking at caregiving as if it's something exceptional, and in my own life, I've always felt and always welcomed the opportunity to be a caregiver to my brother. My family is a team, so I always knew that was going to be a possibility. I was very surprised at how many of my friends and then myself now also have caregiving obligations to a parent. And I think when you think about the world we're living in, the medical advances we have, that caregiving isn't the exception to the rule anymore. And so we all need to think about what families need. And so I wrote down when I was listening to this dialogue that one of the things I've long said would be helpful expanded the definition of family. If we started talking about it in terms of what it really is instead of this 1950s definition. And so in my family, my sister and I are co-guardians, and we share our legal responsibility. And then obviously as siblings, we're also sharing our family joy and responsibility. But that's a different kind of family than the court system is set up for, than activism is set up for. And I can assure you that policy does not necessarily respect it, both in the workplace and then also in the broader community. So I think we probably should have started having this conversation 20 years ago, but now is as good a time as any to get it started. But when I shared with some friends online that I was, last year, I was just feeling very lost and very isolated and very alone. And I was both shocked and so happy to see so many people weigh in and talk about their caregiving experiences. And I realized that this is the norm, and that we are all, just working out the kinks of how you share your needs.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you for enriching this conversation and making it bigger. And it's such a powerful reminder that we are interconnected, and as we work for progress together, the goal is not that an individual can succeed, it's that we all do better when we all do better. And so caregiving and parenting are truly at the core of our values as progressives. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Pamela to move us into next steps.
Thank you so much, Erin. So next steps is we encourage you and truly hope that you will plug into Reproaction's campaigns. Sign up for alerts at reproaction.org, and then please do follow us on social media for unique, fun, and educational and cutting edge content on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are Reproaction. And save the date. Our next Reproaction Act and Learn webinar is going to be a look back at all of the amazing, bold, unapologetic work that we did in 2018. A year of bold direct action looking back at 2018 will take place on Thursday, December 6th at 7 o'clock Eastern. We sincerely hope to see all of y'all popping up in the attendees at that webinar. And with that, it is time for Q&A. So this was such an awesome discussion, and I see that we have a question. So Anna, hello, Anna, says, works for Essential Access Health, which offers parents resources for family communication on sexuality. at a website called talkwithyourkids.org. I'm interested in finding additional resources, listservs, blogs to share with parents. Do you have any suggestions? What and who are y'all reading to talk about sex education and sexuality with your kids?
This is Veronica, and great question. Great question. I get that question a lot, actually. But I will say the first place that comes to mind is Scarlet Teen. It's an OG website, been around forever, and it is run by the amazing Heather Karina. And it's a great place for teens and young adults to get honest, age appropriate, I don't want to say age appropriate, but like real honest answers to their questions about all things sexual health and sexuality. Back in the day when bulletin boards were how we did social media, that bulletin board was on fire. And so there's a lot of stuff that's archived there, but they still take questions from teens and young adults about things and answer it in a way that respects them as humans and as growing adults and not as kids.
Thank you so much. Anybody else want to weigh in? Because I think Scarlet Teen's awesome and has been since the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
As they get older, Bedsider from, I forget the new name, the National Campaign.
Yes.
It also has a tremendous, very, very frank and funny website all about the various forms of birth control and contraception.
Awesome.
For myself, you know what, my kids aren't quite to puberty yet, and given my own career in repro health, they would actually rather that I stop talking about bodies and sexuality and the way they work all the time. I feel pretty confident in that conversation. No, actually, where I wind up where I'm looking for talking points is sometimes in other issues. Like they've come home with questions about like trans kids, and I'm trying to find, like I have the words that would make sense in this crowd, but maybe not to a 9-year-old. So trying to find like the sort of sensitive, like appropriate both to the trans kid and also to my kid who doesn't know any of this. Like I've poked around like the Trans Law Center and other organizations, trying to find this. It gets better. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, I'll add that one of the women who does the Buffering the Vampire Slayer podcast runs mykidisgay.com, which is supposed to be an amazing spot for helping families understand their LGBTQ kids. So I would assume there's probably resources for parents to talk to their non-LGBTQ kids about LGBTQ kids.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that. These are great resources. And so thank you, Anna, for the question. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them into the question tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. While we wait to see if anybody drops any in, I'm going to go ahead and take moderator privilege and toss one out. One of the things, as we said at the beginning of the webinar, I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri, and my city has seen a lot of really amazing activism, but has also experienced a lot of violence and violent reaction to protest. One of the things that my friends have shared, because full disclosure, I'm not a parent, but one of the things my friends have shared is that struggle of how to deal with both their children's interest in what's going on, because I think often we underestimate exactly what children are absorbing, but also their anxiety about what it means for their safety and how they're experiencing the world. So I'm just curious, and I hate to put y'all on the spot, but if you have any insights or experience or resources about that, and particularly when we think about the Trump era that we're currently in, and some of the things that we're seeing across the country, but at the border with Mexico, that, you know, older kids are experiencing that, and progressive kids are thinking, well, we need to do something.
So this is Erin, and I'm going to jump in on this because specifically on the question of the border. So my daughter is 5 years old, and I should back up and say that when Trump became president, we were very clear that we were not going to sugarcoat what was happening, and that we were not going to act like this was simply a president who was more conservative than we'd like, that there was something qualitatively different that was happening and that it was wrong. And so we're driving in the car, and suddenly she says to me, "Mommy, I wish I was an adult." And I said, "Well, why do you wish you were an adult?" And she says, "Because I'm afraid that Donald Trump's going to put me in jail like the other kids." And that point, I sat with it, and I didn't want to just explain it away, because while it is true that given her privilege right now living in Virginia, she's unlikely to be separated from her parents and put in a cage by the president at this moment in time, I also didn't want to comfort her with that, because what's happening is so wrong, and I want her to be aware of how horrifying what's happening is. So I said to her, I said, "Oh, I understand, that's very scary." And I said, "What's my number one job?" And she answered, like she always does, "To keep me safe." And I said, "Yep, that's my number one job. So that's what I'm focused on the most." But I do think that we should be concerned that there are kids whose families are getting separated. And the best thing that we can do is not pretend like it's normal, and to continue to work to stop it. So I just wanted to lift up that experience as someone with, out of the parents on the line, the youngest child who's in a verbal stage, unlike Liz's daughter, who is not quite there yet, that I've taken the stance that I'm going to talk about what's happening honestly, and I'm not going to reassure her and just focus on that I really want her to know that something is deeply wrong and we must fight.
Thank you so much for that, Erin. Veronica or Rachel?
Yeah, this is Veronica, and I'll say that, my daughter's in high school, and she definitely took part in a lot of the protests, that school walkouts in the spring, after Parkland, including, her dad and I said that, like, whatever you need to do to make your voice heard, it's okay, as long as you know that there may be consequences, like skipping school, things like that. But then also talked about safety, safety 101 in terms of rallies and protests. Like, don't get too deep in things. I mean, knowing that things can erupt, and that there are people who are particularly sent to rallies to disrupt the peaceful rallies. And again, because she's 15, we get to talk about those things pretty honestly and openly, and support her in those ways. And then again, in addition, we are Mexican Americans. My family's from Mexico, my husband's family is from Mexico. So these issues are deeply, deeply personal, and we talk about them a lot, and try to, a little bit of what Erin does, not reassure, but assure that we are going to fight this. But then also talk about if the bottom falls out, what do we do? How do we fight back? Do we run? Do we stay? All of those sorts of things. So I think it really is about honesty, and in a way that that they can handle and manage. And I think that a lot of these things are very much like the sexuality talks, that you can't just like throw it all at them at one day. You have to seed it along the way. So if you're talking to them when they're 5 about the world and acknowledging their fear about Trump, or racism or anything that they see, by the time they are 15 and able to actually act on it themselves, you can really have a good conversation as opposed to starting at day one.
That's such great advice. Thank you so much for that. Rachel.
If I can chime in here, I'll sort of split the difference with my elementary age kids. So the school they go to is dual language, Spanish, English. So there is a significant Spanish population at their school. So, a couple of years ago, coming up the election, their understanding is limited. They're getting sort of bits and pieces of it, the way they're talking about it at school. And my daughter would come home and say that, her classmates were saying, if Trump wins, we're going to have to leave the country. If Trump wins, we're going to have to leave, we're going to have to leave school. And I was heartened by the fact that our DC public school was sending out notices, sort of explicit notices saying, nobody is leaving this school. You are all safe here. We are saying nobody is leaving the school no matter what happens. But I did, as Erin was saying about not letting your kids distance themselves too much from communities that are being targeted. I try not to do that, but I also sort of impress on them that the world looks at some of their classmates very differently than they look at them. The chances are that my white son is never going to be taken from me and put in a cage. Chances are, who knows these days? But, I try to impress on them to, as I said earlier, to see and to notice and to try to understand the differences and the way that they will be able to get away with things that their classmates maybe can't. And it is important that they, stand by their friends, that they notice and take action as they get older, as they understand things that they can do. But, that is why we go to the rallies. That is why we make the signs. That is why, being here in DC, close into the White House, we, go every weekend. But that is why, because we are standing with people, even if their life scenarios are not exactly our lives, it is important that we are standing with them.
That is, thank you, the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much to Erin for organizing this month's webinar, to Liz and Veronica and Rachel for wonderful insights and advice and perspective on progressive parenting. And to our attendees for your avid listening and for a great question. So thank you so much for that. As always, you can visit Reproaction at reproaction.org, and we hope you follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We are Reproaction on all three. Thank you to our panelists and to our attendees, and have a fantastic rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.